It was already difficult to accept the passing of my father-in-law, but the shocking revelation from my husband Bob left me utterly stunned. Right in front of me, he declared, "Let's get divorced now that I've got the inheritance. I don't need an ATM like you anymore." For a moment, I couldn't grasp the reality of what Bob was saying. When I asked for clarification, Bob grinned and smugly explained, "I got about $1 million from my dad's inheritance, so I don't need you anymore." He went on to express his frustrations about me, criticizing my appearance and stating, "I had high hopes because it was a match arranged by my dad, but I was disappointed to see such a plain woman like you." Baffled, I questioned him, "Why did you marry me then? You could have just said no." Bob callously replied, "It's obvious, ain't it? For the money. Who'd marry someone like you otherwise?" Unable to stay silent after hearing such hurtful words, I handed him the divorce papers. I decided to agree to the divorce from Bob without revealing something important. As I signed the papers, I silently hoped he would deeply regret this later. My name is Catherine Smith, 42 years old, and I run a fashion company. I got married to Bob, who's 2 years younger, 2 years ago in an arranged marriage facilitated by my father-in-law, Mr. Smith, the CEO of a company I have been dealing with for years. Despite being an only child, Mr. Smith had initially intended for Bob to succeed him, but Bob showed no interest and lacked the necessary skills, eventually dropping out of the running. What initially attracted me to Bob was his laid-back nature, a stark contrast to my serious demeanor. I had always been labeled as inflexible and too serious, struggling to handle things casually. Despite the objections from others, I believed that by being with Bob, I could learn to be more adaptable. During our first date, when the restaurant he recommended was closed, Bob effortlessly changed plans without causing any distress. His ability to adapt was a revelation for someone as rigid as me. I thought being with him could help me become more flexible, and that's why I decided to marry him. However, many people, including my father-in-law, were against our marriage, suggesting I could find someone better. Even Mr. Smith had reservations, warning me about burdening myself with Bob. After our marriage, Bob shocked everyone by quitting his job without consulting anyone. When questioned about it, he nonchalantly stated, "Why do I need to work if you are making money for us both?" This left both my father-in-law and me speechless, wondering why he would solely rely on me for income. I attempted to persuade Bob multiple times, enlisting the help of my father-in-law, but Bob's mindset remained unchanged. Despite my efforts, Bob firmly believed that even if he worked, he couldn't match my income. The temptation to divorce Bob arose right after our marriage, especially when he boldly declared that he'd be a freeloader. While such a statement might have seemed cute coming from a young man in his 20s, it was disconcerting coming from a nearly 40-year-old man. Eventually, we reluctantly agreed that he would take care of household chores. Bob's parents had divorced a few years earlier, and before the divorce, his mother wasn't adept at housework. Bob seemed to make excuses, blaming his mother for his lack of domestic skills. Initially clueless about housework, Bob improved with persistent praise and guidance, though he didn't become exceptionally skilled. Despite this, he looked satisfied, thanks to me handling the house. About a year into our marriage, a significant event occurred when my father-in-law adopted a 9-year-old boy named Jack. Jack was the child of an employee whom my father-in-law had cared for like a grandson. Jack's parents had tragically died in an accident, leaving him without close relatives. My father-in-law decided to adopt him, hoping it would be for the best. Although Bob wasn't thrilled about the situation, my father-in-law relied on me to take care of Jack when needed. As I took on this responsibility, Jack quickly warmed up to me, displaying either friendliness or an effort to fit in. While I felt emotional about the situation, Bob didn't share my sentiments. He seemed unwelcoming towards Jack, expressing concern not about Jack's well-being, but about how the adoption might affect his inheritance. I tried talking to Bob about his conflicted feelings, but to my surprise, he had a different concern. Instead of worrying about Jack, Bob was preoccupied with his inheritance. He even confronted his father, expressing discontent, but returned with an oddly positive mood, assuring me that his share wasn't changing. Perplexed, I asked him to elaborate on what he meant. I'd always believed that even an adopted child like Jack had the same inheritance rights as a biological child. However, something seemed amiss when I noticed my confusion. Smugly, Bob explained, "Dad's making Jack give up his inheritance rights. Makes sense. I'm his only son, after all." The affectionate way in which my father-in-law spoke of Jack clashed with the notion that he might leave him with nothing. I couldn't fully accept this explanation, but Bob dismissed my concerns, stating with relief, "I'm glad." Well, if my father-in-law says so, there must be a reason behind it. Either way, he's still in his 60s, and we probably won't be dealing with any inheritance for a while. In fact, it seems more likely that I divorce Bob before my father-in-law passes away. Nonchalantly pondering such thoughts, I never expected that the moment would arrive sooner than anticipated. A year later, my father-in-law was involved in an accident and never returned. Saying goodbye to him so suddenly overwhelmed me with a profound sense of loss. I had known my father-in-law longer than I had known Bob, and he was a respected man both professionally and privately. As tears wouldn't stop flowing, my eyes heavy and head throbbing, I forced myself to prepare for the funeral. Bob, as the main mourner, appeared distant and not particularly grieving. His lack of tears suggested that perhaps the shock of his father's sudden passing hadn't fully registered. I took charge of making funeral preparations on behalf of Bob, holding back my own tears. Amidst the difficult moment, witnessing Jack cry was the most heart-wrenching. Bob's behavior struck me as peculiar, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. During a moment of relative calm, I asked him, "Isn't something off with you? Aren't you sad about your dad's passing?" My intention was to express concern about his apparent lack of grief, but his unexpected response caught me off guard. "Of course I'm sad," Bob replied, "but I'm also kind of thrilled." Oops, guess my joy showed, huh? "Come on, Catherine, Dad was the CEO, right? He's bound to have some money. How much do you think he left behind? This could be a windfall for us." I had thought Bob was simply zoning out, but from before the funeral up to now, he hadn't been mourning his father at all. Instead, he had been grinning, thinking about the inheritance. Bewildered, I confronted him, asking, "What on earth are you thinking?" Bob, with a calculating look, responded, "Well, think about it. We're divorced, and my mom doesn't have any of it. I'm his only blood child. Jack, being adopted, won't inherit anything. So all the inheritance is mine, you think." I couldn't find any joy in Bob's expression. His face seemed on the brink of laughter, as if he were about to burst into unrestrained amusement. The sight made me feel an intense urge to slap him. That's how much Bob's usually tense countenance had loosened up. He was undeniably delighted from the depths of his heart, and that realization hit me like a punch. Bob was genuinely overjoyed that my stepfather had passed away. Unable to contain my disbelief, I muttered, "I can't believe it. Say whatever you want." The desire to leave was overpowering. But before I could do so, there was something crucial I needed to discuss with Bob concerning Jack. With my stepfather gone, I had temporarily asked Bob to keep Jack at our place. However, if things continued in this manner, Jack would eventually end up in foster care. In that case, I wanted to take on the responsibility of raising Jack myself. That's what occupied my thoughts. To my surprise, Bob agreed surprisingly easily. "Yeah, you going to take him in? Sounds good to me," he said with a nonchalant smile. But then, with a smirk, he held up a single piece of paper, a green paper, a divorce paper. Confused, I asked, and Bob crisply replied, "Let's get a divorce now that I've got the inheritance. I don't need my personal ATM anymore." For a moment, I struggled to comprehend what Bob was saying. Did he just refer to me as an ATM and declare that I'm no longer needed? Seeking clarification, I asked, and Bob smirked while proudly disclosing, I got around $1 million from my dad's inheritance, so I don't need you anymore. Bob continued, reveling in his newfound financial freedom. With this much, I don't have to work anymore. I don't need to please you. I don't have to bother with tedious chores. Oh, how wonderful. He expressed his joy with exaggerated gestures, leaving me deeply shocked. It became apparent that Bob, despite the money coming in after my stepfather's death, wasn't mourning or remembering him. Instead, he seemed genuinely happy, celebrating as if he had won the lottery. The inheritance had brought out a side of Bob I hadn't seen before. Money, it seemed, had the power to drastically change people. Attempting to calm him down, I put my hand on Bob's shoulder, but he quickly shrugged it off, shouting at me with fury. "Shut up, you boring woman. I married you because you were introduced by my father and you were a CEO, but I always felt suffocated with you." Bob proceeded to list his grievances against me, expressing his disappointment from the arranged date set up by his dad. He claimed that he expected someone better but ended up with someone like me. Frustrated, I retorted, "So why did you marry me then? If you had declined, that would have been fine. It's obvious. For the money. Who else would marry someone like you?" Bob laughed, mocking me, and revealed his true intention. He married me for my wealth. He started with, "It's been a while." So I guess it's safe to say, before dropping a shocking fact. I found myself burdened with significant debt, and my father made an offer. If I changed my ways and devoted myself to you, he would pay it off. So naturally, I agreed to marry you. It dawned on me that he never truly loved me. He married me solely for financial reasons. While it wasn't an enjoyable experience, your presence saved me. Bob's crude laughter, however, marked a turning point for me. As I witnessed Bob's demeanor, I realized that I no longer recognized the man before me. The advice I had initially planned to give him was abandoned, and without hesitation, I began filling out the divorce papers. I wrote swiftly, without pausing or second-guessing my decision. Bob, who had been urging the divorce, seemed taken aback, asking, "Hey, are you thinking of getting a divorce now?" In response, I handed him the completed divorce papers, feeling a sense of accomplishment. "We're total strangers now," I declared. "Yeah, whatever happens now doesn't concern the other. You can live with that kid Jack, and I can hang out with younger women. We're free." Bob was ecstatic, displaying a level of happiness that surprised me. During our marriage, I never suspected him of infidelity, but his newfound joy was intriguing. I questioned, "Bob, if you were this happy about it, you should have divorced sooner." He nonchalantly responded, "I had my reasons. I wanted the money," stuffing the divorce papers into his bag before hastily leaving the house. Remaining in the home where I had lived with Bob didn't feel right, and I decided it was time to start fresh somewhere new, especially with Jack. Selling the house seemed like a good move, and I considered living close to my parents. While it would necessitate Jack transferring schools, he was okay with it. The prospect of finding a new place without reservations excited me. Choosing a new home proved challenging, but I eventually settled on a property based on its proximity to my parents and excellent location. Despite the high price, the spacious and elegantly decorated house, complete with ample storage and a surprising addition of a pool, stood out. While I personally didn't see the need for a pool, witnessing Jack's excitement made it worthwhile. Jack's eyes lit up at the sight of our new luxurious house, and his happiness became my priority. It took some time for both Jack and me to adjust, but our new home soon became a comforting haven. During this time, Bob called me, sounding desperate and expressing a desire to meet and apologize immediately. Although I had a hunch about his sudden change of heart, I decided to meet him, leaving Jack with my mother and heading to the specified diner. Upon arrival, Bob stood up, looking pale and on the verge of tears. My cold look met his gaze as he stammered, "Catherine, what do you want?" I retorted, "We're supposed to be strangers now." "Don't say that." Bob admitted, "The truth is, my dad had debts." I never anticipated that Bob would end up like this. "You inherited $1 million, right? Just pay it off," I suggested. However, It turned out that the debts exceeded the inheritance. After inheriting both assets and liabilities, Bob was now burdened with debt. It was surprising to me that I had also inherited the debt. Bob looked defeated as he pleaded, "Please, Catherine, you must have some savings. We were married once. Please help me out." His plea was accompanied by a flattering smile. It struck me as audacious that he would contact me for help, after all the times he belittled me, even calling me an ATM. Over the phone, he had mentioned wanting to apologize, but that apology had yet to materialize. Did Bob even remember what he had said before? "After all the times you belittled me, even calling me an ATM, who would want to help you now?" I asked. His convenience astounded me. He probably thought he wouldn't need money from me anymore. Now that he did, he seemed to be grinding it out. I asserted that I couldn't meet his expectations and that I didn't have the money. Bob accused me of lying, claiming that my business was thriving. Frustrated, I responded, "Not every bank lends to everyone, right? Why would I lend if I don't expect it back?" Bob remembered the harsh words he had once thrown at me and looked a bit guilty, yet he didn't apologize. Despite his past actions, he asked, "Don't you care what happens to me?" I reminded him of his words during our divorce, stating that we were strangers now and had nothing to do with each other. I couldn't comprehend how he could act like the victim and have the audacity to ask for help. Despite his guilt, he didn't apologize, maintaining a proud demeanor. Bob mentioned life insurance. My father-in-law had named Jack as the beneficiary. When Bob inquired, "Can't we start over?" I dismissed it, leaving the diner, stating there was nothing more I could do for him. As I left, I could hear Bob's pitiful cries, but it was just noise to me. I rushed home, thinking about Jack and hoping he wasn't hungry. Bob, on the other hand, was working multiple part-time jobs to pay off his debts. With no work experience, qualifications, or motivation, he struggled to secure a full-time job. I once spotted him working at a convenience store, looking much older and thinner. Now, living peacefully with Jack, we even had our occasional arguments. Though it saddened me when Jack ignored me after a fight, I saw it as a sign that he was opening up to me. My goal in life was to support Jack until he could stand on his own 2 feet, aligning with what my father-in-law might have wished for.